Correctional policy for offenders with mental illness, creating a new paradigm for recidivism reduction. Author Jennifer LSKEEM, Sara MANCHAK, and Jillian K. Peterson. Part 2. Explaining other forms of recidivism. Beyond explaining the criminal behavior of a small minority of offenders with mental illness, the criminalization hypothesis may also help explain recidivism. That occurs without criminal behavior in the broader population. Criminal justice involvement may deepen via revocation or reincarceration, even in the absence of new crimes and new victims. If the goal is to end criminal justice involvement, the policy model must take this form of failure into account. Applying the criminalization hypothesis, community supervision, officers may attach a criminal label to deviant behavior by these offenders that permits inappropriate revocation of release. Although more research is needed, more evidence suggests that officers and judges apply lower thresholds for revoking community supervision as a function of mental illness. Offenders both with and without mental illness are about equally likely to be rearrested for a new offense. However, those with mental illness are significantly more likely to commit technical violations and to have their community terms suspended or revoked. These observations are consistent with findings that correctional officers respond conservatively to offenders with mental illness, perhaps out of fear of paternalization or paternalism. Based on an experiment conducted with 264 probation officers who read case vignettes, Loudon, Gillig, and SKEEM 2009 found that mental illness, particularly schizophrenia, increased officers' perceptions of violent risk and promoted plans to keep the probationer under close surveillance and on a short leash. Ethnography suggests that reincarceration sometimes is inappropriately used for parolees in emotional crisis. In one case, a psychotic parolee who disclosed suicidal thoughts was arrested and taken to the county jail for his safety. Similarly, based on a sample of over 200 probationers with mental illness, Solomon and Drain, 1995, found that case managers often collaborated with probation officers to seek reincarceration on a technical violation and jail-based treatment for those who were perceived to be non-compliant with treatment. Together, these findings are consistent with the notion that some supervision failures reflect criminalization of mental illness rather than new crime. Conceptual framework for expanding research and policy. Moderated mediation effect of mental illness on criminal behavior. The theories and evidence reviewed above can be integrated to outline a conceptual framework for future research, policy, and intervention. As shown in Figure 1, the criminalization hypothesis and current policy focus suggests that there is a direct relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior. This model may apply to a small subgroup of offenders with mental illness, perhaps 1 in 10. Also shown in Figure 1, the alternative models, example criminological and social personality, suggest that the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior is fully mediated by a third variable, example poverty, social learning, that establishes general risk factors for crime. This model may apply to the vast majority of offenders with mental illness based on available evidence. Then we propose that the effect of mental illness on criminal behavior is one of moderated mediation. That is, whether the effect is mediated or direct varies across subgroups of offenders with mental illness. Although the effect is usually indirect, it depends on the subgroup to which an offender belongs. As explained later, a major task for future research will be to identify the specific moderator that differentiates the subgroups to whom the effect is direct versus mediated. One simple variable that may mark a potential moderator is age of onset for criminal behavior, i.e., child-set adolescence versus adulthood. Hodgins 2000 proposes that there are two types of offenders with mental illness. Early start offenders exhibit a stable pattern of antisocial behavior from a young age, while late start offenders exhibit antisocial behavior only after the onset of major mental disorder. Page 91. As explained by Silver, 2006, from a theoretical standpoint, the heart of the distinction between early and late start offenders is that early start offenders are from the beginning more deeply embedded in and exposed to criminogenic risk factors both in themselves and in their social behavior environments. Page 700. For late starters, mental illness seems to play a more casual role in offending. There is some support for this distinction, particularly for violent behavior. Here is, let me see if I can try and get the glare off. There you go. So here's the model. Moderated mediation effect of mental illness on crime and behavior. Crime behavior. Partial mediation. I'm sorry about the glare. Partial mediation of other forms of recidivism. The effect of mental illness on criminal behavior may differ from its effect on recidivism, i.e. revocation and reincarceration without a new crime. Although more research is needed, available evidence suggests that the effect of mental illness on recidivism is partially mediated by system bias, officers' stigma, close monitoring, paternalism, etc. This process is depicted in Figure 2. Using the model to revisit program effectiveness, the proposed model A expands explanatory mechanisms beyond the psychiatric realm to incorporate criminological and social psychological factors, and B disaggregates recidivism to account for different processes that may explain criminal behavior versus recidivism. For other reasons, this model may help explain why contemporary programs are not consistently reducing recidivism. See tables 1.12. On the one hand, because they are run by specialty officers, judges, and others with interests in mental health, some of these programs theoretically would reduce system bias that partially mediates the relationship between mental illness and recidivism, i.e. revocation and reincarceration without new crime. On the other hand, the effect of these programs on the true recidivism target criminal behavior would be limited and could vary with group composition. Specifically, effective psychiatric treatment would reduce recidivism for the small subgroup of offenders for whom mental illness has a direct effect on criminal behavior. It is less likely that such treatment would reduce recidivism for the larger subgroup where the effect of mental illness is fully mediated by general risk factors. For this larger subgroup, it is possible that effective treatment would improve psychosocial functioning, which would promise or promote a less criminal lifestyle, which would reduce criminal behavior. See Silver, 2006. However, this scenario seems unlikely to occur readily or often. First, it may be difficult to simply undo the causal process from a criminological perspective, even if mental illness contributed to downward socioeconomic drift. It is unlikely that symptom improvement will reverse poverty or associated criminogenic factors that are more socioeconomic than medical. Example, homelessness, victimization, Fisher and Drake, 2007. Second, the factors that originally caused criminal behavior may differ from those that maintain it. From a social personality perspective, it is unlikely that symptom improvement will change such factors as an established history of benefiting from criminal activity and personal attitudes and values supportive of criminal behavior. Anecdotes gathered from working with frontline staff in programs across the country suggest another reason for variability in effectiveness. Sometimes everyday practice may be more nuanced than the explicit policy focus on mental health would suggest. As shown later, to the extent that staff intuitively focus on changing an individual's general risk factors for crime, programs may be more effective in reducing criminal behavior than those that bank more exclusively on psychiatric services. Implications for advancing research and practice. Having articulated a conceptual framework that is consistent with but goes beyond available evidence, we now outline how it can be further tested and applied to develop a more coherent and effective policy of supervising and treating subgroups of offenders with mental illness, i.e., developing real evidence-based practice. We also provide recommendations for practice based on what is known now. Priority number 1, identify offenders for whom mental illness directly causes criminal behavior. Research and policy development. For perhaps 1 in 10 offenders in this population, the covariation between their most visible status, mental illness, and present state. Justice involvement is not merely an illusionary correlation for the subgroup. The current policy emphasis on linkage with psychiatric services should go far in preventing new victims and new arrests. A major task for future research is to identify the moderator, example, demographic, socioeconomic, clinical, criminal, or other factors at work in the moderated mediation model. As noted earlier, one promising potential marker is late age of onset for criminal behavior. Once a method is identified for isolating this subgroup, we can determine whether effective psychiatric treatment alone reduces recidivism risk. Current practice, it is important not to lose sight of the fact that mental illness is strongly related to criminal behavior. For subgroup of offenders, while keeping the subgroup size in perspective, even among those with psychosis symptoms directly cause crime for only a small fraction of offenders. Thus, there is an onus on practitioners to clearly demonstrate that an individual belongs to the subgroup. Until an evidence-based method is developed to do so, practitioners will have to articulate how an individual's patterns of offending can be directly attributed to symptoms and demonstrate this with data from that individual's history. See LSKEEM and Mulvey 2002. Once identified, individuals in this subgroup should respond to effective and or evidence-based psychiatric treatment with a reduction in recidivism. Still, all offenders with mental illness, including those in this subgroup, must have a basic level of good enough community supervision, although officers who establish authoritarian relationships and rely almost exclusively on such negative pressures as threats of incarceration may be detrimental to all offenders. Those with serious mental illness seem particularly vulnerable to such influences. If so, poor supervision practices exclusive focus on surveillance within the context of an authoritarian relationship or an exclusive factor on offender needs within the context of a permissive relationship may undermine the positive effects of treatment. Priority number 2, for the vast majority, expanding to the focus to incorporate or to explicitly identify evidence-based corrections. Contemporary policy is likely to have limited effect on recidivism for the large subgroup of offenders for whom the relationship between mental illness and criminal behavior is indirect. As suggested earlier, it may be that the causal process cannot be reversed via the same mediational route, and or the factors that cause criminal behavior differ from those that maintain it. These are testable propositions. However, from a practical standpoint, it may not matter that mental illness is a distal contributor to criminal behavior. The focus must be expanded beyond linkage with psychiatric treatment. Two directions hold particular promise for arriving at a coherent policy model for this subgroup. A. Adapting existing evidence-based correctional programs to the abilities of these offenders and evaluating their effectiveness, and B. Isolating the ingredients of existing programs that reduce recidivism. Research and policy development, leveraging evidence-based corrections. The time is ripe to apply evidence-based corrections to offenders with mental illness and evaluate their effectiveness. Cognitive behavioral group treatment programs like reasoning and rehabilitation, moral recognition therapy, and generic versions that reduce criminal thinking and build pro-social skills have been shown to reduce general offenders' recidivism. One of these programs has been adapted to address the cognitive limitations that some offenders with mental illness have, but its effect on recidivism has yet to be tested. This is a clear direction for research and policy development. These packaged programs are consistent with principles of intervention that embody the dominant model of what works for offenders: risk, need, responsivity. The R&R Andrews and Press. R&R is underpinned by the social personality theory outlined above. According to that theory, contingencies must be changed to increase rewards and satisfactions for alternatives to criminal behavior. For example, for an antisocial pattern, emphasis would be placed on building skills in problem solving and self-regulation and reinforcing use of these skills. What are the R&R principles? Research indicates that offenders are less likely to recidivate when programs match the intensity of supervision and treatment to their level risk for recidivism. Risk principle target their criminogenic needs or changeable risk factors for recidivism. Need principle and match modes of service to their abilities and styles. Responsivity principles see Andrews et al. 2006, Lowenkamp, Peeler, Smith, and Leticia 2006, Lowenkamp et al. 2006. The last principle is particularly germane. The most effective programs for reducing recidivism are those that target needs closely related to criminality. Specifically, the effectiveness of correctional programs in reducing recidivism is positively associated with the number of criminogenic needs they target, i.e., dynamic risk factors for crime. Like pro-criminal attitudes, relative non-criminogenic needs, i.e., disturbances that impinge on an individual's functioning in society, like depression, because mental illness is not criminogenic need for this subgroup. It is important to target stronger risk factors for crime. At the same time, in revising policy for this group, the role of psychiatric treatment should be contextualized, not jettisoned. We assume that all offenders with serious mental illness must have a basic level of good enough mental health services. First, as suggested above, correctional programs are more effective in reducing recidivism when services are matched to the abilities, styles, and needs of offenders. Effective psychiatric treatment may complement correctional treatment by, for example, reducing hallucinations that interfere with an offender's ability to attend to and benefit from cognitive behavioral sessions that target the criminal thinking. Second, even if mental health services have no effect on recidivism, direct or indirect, they may achieve crucial public health outcomes for offenders with mental illness. Example, reducing symptoms, substance abuse, and hospitalization. For example, an ACT team may not reduce recidivism, but is quite likely to reduce repeated hospitalizations. Research and policy development isolating effective components of existing programs. Our review suggests that some programs for offenders with mental illness work to reduce recidivism, but there is no evidence that they do so for the reasons assumed. An important goal for future research is to identify the mechanisms by which programs reduce recidivism. Understanding what is crucial to treatment and how it operates will help develop interventions that are fewer, more efficient, and more effective in respect of offenders with mental illness. The existing wealth of program operationalizations only underscores the need to identify change mechanisms and bring greater parsimony to the field. This is essential for developing model programs that can be widely decimated at a local level greater than that exists now. And in today's economic environment, policymakers should insist on knowing why programs work, because this will enable them to streamline programs while protecting their most essential elements. For most offenders with mental illness, we suspect that existing programs work when they work in some of the same ways that programs for general offenders work. First, we have found that specialty probation reduces risk of recidivism less because of mental health service linkage of symptom reduction than because specialty officers, more than traditional officers, are likely to apply core correctional practices, like establishing firm but fair and caring relationships with offenders, and using problem-solving strategies that rather than threats of incarceration. Similarly, the review above hints that existing programs may be effective when they involve ongoing specialty judicial or correctional supervisions or some focus on criminal thinking. Second, given the medicalization of socioeconomic problems like unemployment, homelessness, some psychiatric services, example supported employment, may actually help mitigate the criminogenic effect of unhealthy social environments that affect all the offenders. Third, anecdotally, we have learned that staff members and mental health courts or other programs sometimes target factors that get an offender in trouble. Example, hanging out with his or his drug dealing cousin. If so, they are intuitively applying the R&R principle of targeting criminogenic needs. These hypotheses can be tested to make active program ingredients an explicit part of policy. Current practice, much needs to be done to develop a specific evidence base for the large subgroup of offenders for whom the effect of mental illness on criminal behavior may be indirect and fully mediated in the interim. Two existing evidence bases can be referenced to tailor practice to individual offenders in this group who differ substantially in their degrees of risk recidivism based on core risk factors, example, antisocial personality pattern, criminal history, and levels of psychopathology and functional impairment. These two dimensions correspond to evidence-based practices, A, in corrections that have been shown to reduce recidivism risk for offenders, and B, in mental health services that have been shown to achieve positive patient outcomes. As shown in Figure 3, adapted from Pence and Draper, 2009, an offender's constellation of criminogenic risk and clinical impairment can inform sentencing and supervision in a manner that references the strongest evidence for addressing these often different problems. For those at considerable risk for recidivism, evidence-based correctional principles should help reduce that risk. For those with pronounced clinical impairment, evidence-based mental health practices like IDDT, supported employment, supported housing, or even ACT should help reduce hospitalization symptoms or employment or housing problems. For review, see Osher and Stedman, 2007. This model reserves the most intensive supervision and treatment resources for those with the greatest criminogenic risk and clinical need. For low-risk, low-need individuals, good enough supervision practices and psychiatric treatment in the community should suffice. Although these propositions rest on sound bases of evidence at present, Their effect in tandem must be tested in future research. Priority number 3, assessing and addressing, clue on that if you want to pause that. Assessing and addressing system bias. Thus far, we have presented priorities for better responding to individuals to reduce criminal behavior. These efforts must be complemented by an effort to assess and address the role that system bias can play in recidivism where there is no criminal behavior. The proposed model posits that the relation between mental illness and supervision failure is partially mediated by system bias. Research and policy development, more intensive research is needed to increase the understanding of the specific reasons for recidivism. Offenders with mental illness appear particularly likely to incur technical violations that can lead to supervision failure. To what extent is this because those with mental illness have functional impairments that reduce their ability to adhere to much standard conditions of community release as maintaining employment or paying fines and fees. B, are required to abide by more conditions of release, example, mandated treatment, than those without mental illness, and or C, are subject to increased monitoring and control, which increases the likelihood that minor infractions will be detected. The answer to such questions can inform targeted policy reforms designed to reduce supervision failure via modification of the conditions of release, stigma-sensitive training of supervision officers, or both. Practice implications when they are behaving no worse than offenders without mental illness. It seems inappropriate to use incarceration to achieve social control over offenders with mental illness, regardless of whether this is motivated by fear or paternalism. It is important to remain mindful of our tendency to more closely watch offenders with mental illness and to more forcefully respond to their behavior. Even if evidence-based strategies in mental health and corrections are ideally matched to subgroups of offenders with mental illness, these individuals will continue to fail as long as we maintain an unusually high threshold for their success. We hope that the framework we have offered will facilitate continued advance in science and practice that inform one another to improve policy and outcomes for this larger and important group. Here's the acknowledgments, and here is, I'll try and get as close as I can should you want to look any of these references up. However, you can always look at the link below for the direct should you wish to research this further. And that will conclude this article. Thank you.